The alien woman pointed a weapon at me, then asked, "Why do your eyes look familiar, HFY?" The planet seemed lifeless at first glance. Its landscape was a mixture of jagged rocks, deep chasms, and sparse vegetation that barely seemed to hold onto life. Jard, a seasoned human explorer, had seen places like this before. He had traveled far from Earth, visiting planets where few dared to step. But there was something different about this one, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't just the eerie silence, but the feeling that he wasn't alone. Jard had come here on a hunch. A distress signal, old but still somehow active, had drawn him to this forsaken world. It was a signal no one else seemed to have noticed. That alone had been enough to pique his interest. The signal had been encrypted, containing strange patterns, the kind that didn't match any known human or alien technology. After hours of tracking it, he had arrived at the source, a hidden outpost unmarked on any map. Now, standing at the entrance to the underground facility, Jard couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on him. It was clear no one had been here for years, perhaps longer. Dust had gathered in thick layers on the metal doors, and the air smelled of decay. But the signal was unmistakable. It came from within. With a sense of resolve, he stepped forward and pushed the door open. Inside, the corridors were narrow and dimly lit. The walls were covered in strange markings and symbols, all of which seemed to pulse faintly with a life of their own. Jard's boots echoed through the hall as he moved deeper into the facility. His hand rested lightly on the hilt of his plasma gun, though he had no idea what he was expecting to find. There were no signs of life, no other creatures, no alarms, no warnings, just the hum of old machinery. He rounded a corner and paused, his eyes narrowing. There ahead of him was a figure. It was a woman standing perfectly still, her back to him. She was tall, cloaked in a dark, flowing outfit that seemed to blend with the shadows of the room. But it wasn't her clothing that caught Jard's attention, it was her eyes. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. There was something about her eyes, something familiar. They were a shade of green that reminded him of something he couldn't place, something distant. They seemed to glow softly, almost unnaturally in the dim light. She had turned toward him just slightly, enough for him to see that she was aware of his presence, though she hadn't made a sound. Jard's hand instinctively went to his side, his fingers brushing the cool surface of his weapon. His mind raced. Was this an enemy? A survivor of some long-lost expedition, or something more? Before he could decide, she spoke. "Why do your eyes look familiar?" Her voice was calm, smooth, with an odd lilt to it, like she had not expected to speak in such a long time. It was the question that threw Jard off more than anything else. The weapon in her hand, a sleek and deadly-looking energy blaster, remained pointed at him, but her tone was not one of hostility. It was almost curious, almost fascinated. Jard blinked, his mind spinning. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The woman did not lower her weapon. Instead, she took a slow step toward him, her gaze never leaving his face. As she moved, her body seemed to blend with the shadows, as if she were part of the very surroundings. Her eyes, though, remained fixed on him, and there was an intensity in them that Jard couldn't quite understand. They held a knowledge, a depth that felt ancient. And something about them felt like a reflection of his own gaze, the kind of gaze he had seen in his own reflection countless times, if only he could remember where. "Your eyes," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper now. "They are not like the others, they speak to me. I do not know how, but they are familiar." Jard stood there, completely still. He wasn't sure what to do. Part of him wanted to reach for his weapon to defend himself. The other part of him was curious, drawn to this mysterious woman in a way he couldn't explain. He had encountered alien species before, but none had ever reacted to him like this. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jard finally said, his voice taking on a more defensive tone. "I've never been here before, I don't even know who you are." The woman's eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps recognition. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if searching for something deep within him. Her weapon lowered slightly, though not entirely. Her fingers still hovered near the trigger, ready to react if necessary. "You are human," she said almost to herself, as though confirming something she already knew. "I can see that, feel it, but it is not just that. Your eyes, they have seen the stars, haven't they? They have crossed time and space just like mine." Jard frowned. This woman wasn't making any sense. What did she mean by cross time and space? He didn't have time to figure it out. He needed answers, and he needed to be careful. Something about this place, something about her wasn't right. I don't know what you're talking about, he repeated. But if you do lower that weapon, I will have to. The woman's eyes narrowed, and she stepped forward again, her movements fluid and silent. You will have to what? Her voice was sharp now, the calmness gone. You think I am just some creature you can threaten? You think your weapons will matter here? Jard's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. His fingers curled around the handle of his plasma gun, but he didn't draw it yet. This was different. She was different. There was something about her presence that made him hesitate. She stopped just in front of him, her face now inches from his. The weapon still hovered between them, but it no longer felt like an immediate threat. There was a strange energy in the air, like the tension before a storm. I have lived in the dark, she said, her voice softer now, almost reflective. In the shadows of forgotten places. And yet your eyes, they call to me. I do not know how, but I must know why. Jard didn't know how to respond. The connection, or whatever it was becoming overwhelming. It was as if the universe had brought him here for a reason. But what was that reason? Why did she seem to recognize him, or at least his eyes, as if they were a key to something greater? Before he could speak again, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Jard's hand instinctively went to his weapon again, but the woman raised a hand to stop him. Stay still, she whispered, her voice tense. They are not ours. Jard's eyes widened. Who else was here? He had to make a decision. Should he trust this strange woman, or should he prepare for whatever came next? As the footsteps grew louder, Jard's thoughts raced. The woman was right. He didn't have much time. He couldn't back down, not now, not when there was something so much bigger at stake. The sound of the footsteps stopped just around the corner. The woman glanced toward the shadowy passageway, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to Jard, her weapon still drawn, but her eyes softening just slightly. You don't know it yet, she said quietly, but you've already crossed a line, and now there's no turning back. Jard didn't have time to question her words. As the first figure stepped into view, his heart skipped a beat. Jard barely had time to process the woman's words when the figure stepped into view. His eyes went wide as he saw the creature emerge from the shadows. It wasn't a human, that much was certain. The figure stood tall, its body covered in thick, dark armor that shimmered slightly under the faint lights of the outpost. Its helmet was sleek, with two glowing red eyes staring straight at Jard. The mercenary. Jard's heart raced as he instinctively reached for his weapon. The woman beside him did the same, but her movements were quick and deliberate. She had lowered her weapon slightly, but it was still ready to strike if necessary. For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them palpable, but neither of them dared to make the first move. The figure, still obscured by its helmet, stopped just a few feet away, as if waiting for something. Jard could feel the weight of the situation press down on him, each breath coming heavier than the last. Who are you? Jard demanded, his voice firm, though his hands shook slightly as they hovered over his plasma gun. He knew that confrontation was inevitable, but he didn't know what to expect. His instincts screamed at him to be ready for anything. The mercenary's helmet remained still, but Jard could feel its gaze, cold, calculating, as if weighing his every word. I'm not here for you, human, the voice of the mercenary sounded through a voice modulator, cold and impersonal. But I know who she is. Jard glanced at the woman beside him, his mind racing. You know her? He asked, his voice thick with disbelief. The mercenary's attention snapped back to the woman, and for the first time, Jard noticed something in the figure's posture. There was a certain tension, a readiness to strike if needed. Whoever this woman was, she was important. The woman beside him, who had so far remained calm and distant, stepped forward. I am Lyra, she said, her voice low and steady, but Jard could hear the underlying strain. She wasn't afraid, but there was something else in her voice. And I suggest you leave, now. The mercenary didn't move. Its red eyes flickered, and Jard could feel the weight of its gaze shift back and forth between him and Lyra. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was broken only by the hum of the old machinery and the distant sound of wind sweeping across the barren landscape outside. You should listen to her, Jard said, taking a step forward, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. You won't win this fight. There's no reason for any of us to get hurt. The mercenary's head tilted slightly, as though it was considering Jard's words. You misunderstand, human, the voice modulator crackled. You have no idea what's at stake here. The mercenary then reached down to its belt and pulled out a small device, a communicator of some kind. It clicked it on, speaking into it briefly. Secure the area. We have our targets. Don't let them escape. Jard's eyes widened. Targets? What did that mean? He had no time to ask more questions before the figure started moving again, but this time it was not aiming for them. The mercenary moved past them, toward the far side of the room, its movements precise, like that of a trained soldier. What do you mean? Jard turned to Lyra, but she was already moving, her hand quickly grabbing his arm and pulling him toward a narrow hallway at the far end of the chamber. She was strong, faster than he expected, and he barely had time to react before they were running down the darkened corridor. Follow me, she hissed. There's no time to explain. We have to get to the artifact before they do. Jard stumbled for a moment, his feet catching on the uneven floor. Wait, what artifact? What's going on? He could barely keep up with her pace. She wasn't waiting for him to catch up, though. She was pulling him along, guiding him through the winding halls like she had been here 100 times before. There's no time for questions, she snapped. Trust me, I'll explain later, but we need to reach the chamber. They're already on their way. If they get to it first, she didn't finish the sentence, but Jard could hear the urgency in her voice. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The air felt thicker the further they went, and Jard couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His instincts screamed that danger was closing in. The sense of urgency in Lyra's movements only intensified his unease. Finally, they reached a large set of doors at the end of the corridor. They were ancient, clearly untouched for decades, if not centuries. The symbols on them were faded, nearly unreadable, but they were unlike anything Jard had ever seen before. Lyra's fingers moved quickly over the controls, pressing a series of buttons in rapid succession. The doors slid open with a low groan, revealing a room that seemed to pulse with energy. Inside, the room was bathed in an otherworldly glow, casting everything in strange, shimmering light. In the center of the room sat an ancient pedestal, atop which rested a small, glowing artifact. It was unlike anything Jard had ever seen. Its surface seemed to shift, changing colors as if it were alive. The artifact radiated a sense of power, its energy almost tangible in the air around it. Lyra stepped into the room first, her gaze fixed on the artifact. "This is it," she said quietly, almost reverently. "This is the key." Jard stood back, unsure of what to say. He had no idea what the artifact was or what it was supposed to do, but he could feel the weight of its significance. It was clear that Lyra wasn't the only one who wanted it. "They're coming," Lyra whispered, glancing over her shoulder toward the hallway. "We don't have much time. If we don't activate it now, everything will be lost." Jard's heart skipped a beat. "Activate it? How? What's going to happen?" Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she moved quickly to the pedestal, her hands dancing over the controls. The symbols on the artifact began to glow brighter, and the room seemed to vibrate with energy. Jard could feel the temperature rising, the air growing thick with tension. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from behind them. The mercenaries had found their way in. Jard turned, his eyes scanning the room. The doorway was now blocked by a group of heavily armored mercenaries. Their weapons were drawn, and they didn't seem interested in negotiation. Jard's fingers twitched around his plasma gun, but he knew there was no way they could fight their way out of this. Lyra didn't even look back. Her focus remained on the artifact, her hands moving faster as she worked to unlock its secrets. "We don't have time," she repeated, her voice sharp with urgency. Jard felt his pulse racing as he glanced at the approaching mercenaries. There were too many of them. They couldn't fight them all off, not with the numbers they had. He had to trust Lyra. She had to know what she was doing. Suddenly, the room grew brighter, and the artifact began to hum with a low, powerful vibration. The mercenaries hesitated for a moment, sensing the change in the air. Then, one of them took a step forward, raising his weapon. "Stop!" Lyra's voice rang out. She had finished whatever she had been doing. The artifact glowed brightly, and a pulse of energy shot out from it, knocking the mercenaries back. They scrambled to regain their footing, but it was too late. Jard barely had time to react. The entire room seemed to shift, and suddenly they were no longer alone. The artifact had activated, and the world around them seemed to warp. Time itself felt like it was slowing down. Lyra turned to Jard, her expression a mix of triumph and something deeper, something like fear. "It's done," she said. "The artifact is activated, but we've opened something far more dangerous than we ever anticipated." Jard had no time to process what she had just said. As the mercenaries gathered themselves, he realized that the real battle was only just beginning. The moment the artifact activated, everything around Jard seemed to change. The air itself felt charged, electric, as though the entire room had come alive. He glanced at Lyra, who stood motionless, her eyes locked onto the glowing object in front of them. The mercenaries had been knocked back by the blast, but they were already recovering, scrambling to their feet. One of them, a large figure clad in black armor, raised his weapon, his red eyes gleaming beneath his helmet. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice harsh, but Lyra didn't flinch. She was staring at the artifact as if it were the only thing in the universe. And to her, it might as well have been. Jard was still trying to comprehend the energy he'd just felt. The artifact had released a pulse, a shockwave that seemed to warp the very fabric of space. His head swam with confusion. What was this thing? Why was it so powerful? Lyra's desperate urgency was making more sense now, but what had she meant by "we've opened something far more dangerous"? "Lyra," Jard shouted, taking a step toward her, but she didn't respond. She was still focused on the artifact, her hands hovering just above it as if she were trying to pull some kind of energy from it. The mercenaries weren't about to let up. They had regained their footing, and now they were advancing again, their weapons aimed directly at Jard and Lyra. "Stop what you're doing, alien!" the armored figure yelled, his voice thick with malice. "That artifact is ours. Hand it over now and we might let you live." Jard's heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: they had to get out of here. There was no way they were going to survive a firefight against these mercenaries, not with the kind of firepower they were packing. But before he could formulate a plan, Lyra suddenly spoke, her voice calm, though there was an underlying tension that Jard could feel. "You're too late," she said, not even looking at the mercenaries. "The artifact is awake now. It has its own will." The mercenaries hesitated for a brief moment, clearly thrown off by her words. But they quickly recovered, the lead mercenary snarling. "What are you talking about? This is just an ancient relic, a weapon, and it belongs to the highest bidder." Lyra's eyes finally left the artifact, turning slowly toward the mercenaries. Her expression was unreadable. "You don't understand," she whispered almost to herself. "You've woken it up. Now it's going to wake them." Jard's confusion deepened. Who were they? And what did she mean by waking them up? But there was no time to ask questions. The ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble that seemed to echo from deep within the planet. The mercenaries exchanged uncertain glances, but before they could react, a loud screeching noise filled the air. The walls of the room shook violently and the lights flickered. Then the floor began to crack. A deep, hollow sound filled the air as large, jagged cracks appeared in the ground around the pedestal. Jard barely had time to step back as one of the walls burst open with a force so powerful it sent debris flying. Through the massive hole in the wall, something began to emerge, something huge, something otherworldly. It was a creature, a massive being with dark, leathery wings that stretched far wider than anything Jard had ever seen. Its eyes were glowing, bright and fierce, and its body was covered in dark, armor-like scales. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Jard's mouth went dry as he realized the creature was coming toward them. This wasn't just some alien, it was a predator, a being of unimaginable power. The mercenaries were already firing their weapons, their plasma shots lighting up the room as they tried to take the creature down. But their attacks barely seemed to affect it. The massive being swiped its enormous claws through the air, sending several mercenaries flying backward. Its roar echoed throughout the room, shaking the walls. Lyra wasn't fazed. She had already moved, stepping closer to the artifact, her fingers moving in rapid patterns above it. She spoke something in a language Jard couldn't understand, but the artifact seemed to respond. The light around them grew brighter, and the creature, whatever it was, paused for a moment, its glowing eyes turning toward Lyra. It was as if it sensed something, as if it recognized her. You're one of them," the creature rumbled, its voice deep and guttural. "You are chosen." Jard's mind raced, trying to catch up. One of them? Chosen for what? But before he could ask, the creature's attention shifted, its gaze locking onto him. It bared its sharp teeth, and Jard could feel a cold shiver crawl up his spine. "You," the creature growled, its voice full of malice. "Human." Lyra's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Stay back," she ordered, her tone hardening. "You don't need to fight him." The creature didn't move, but it seemed to hesitate. Its eyes flickered back to Lyra. "You are not his," it said, as if the idea itself was a puzzle it couldn't quite solve. Jard's head was spinning. Who was Lyra to this creature? And why did it call him human with such venom? He felt a surge of anger. He didn't want to be just human, not now. Not in front of whatever this was. "We need to get out of here," Jard said, his voice sharp. He moved toward Lyra, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the pedestal. She didn't resist, but her eyes never left the creature. The mercenaries were still trying to fight off the beast, but they were hopelessly outmatched. One of them had already been thrown against the wall with a sickening thud. The others were retreating, their weapons useless against the massive creature. "You'll die here," the creature hissed at the mercenaries, its voice a low growl. "You awaken the wrong forces." Lyra pulled away from Jard's grip, her eyes locked onto the creature. "We don't have time for this," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "The artifact is opening a gateway, and once it does, we won't have anywhere to run." Jard's mind was still reeling. A gateway? What did she mean? But there was no time for answers. The floor was cracking, and the entire room seemed to be falling apart. There was no escape, not from the creature, not from the mercenaries, and certainly not from whatever was about to come through that gateway. "Lyra, we need to leave," Jard shouted, tugging on her arm again. But she stood her ground, staring at the massive creature as if she were trying to communicate with it. "They won't stop it," Lyra said, her voice strangely calm. "We can't stop it." The creature roared again, the sound so loud it nearly deafened Jard. Then, before he could react, it surged forward, its massive wings flapping and sending gusts of wind through the room. With terrifying speed, it reached the mercenaries, swiping them aside as though they were mere insects. Jard's heart pounded in his chest as the room seemed to collapse around them, but Lyra stood firm, her eyes still locked on the creature. "There's only one way to stop it," she said quietly. Jard didn't understand, but he knew one thing for certain. If they didn't act fast, they were both going to die. The creature's roar echoed through the collapsing room, filling Jard's ears with a bone-rattling vibration. His heart was pounding, and his thoughts raced as he looked around, trying to understand what was happening. The room was falling apart, debris falling from the ceiling and the walls cracking wide open. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the once bright light from the artifact dimmed, flickering like a dying star. Lyra stood in the middle of the chaos, her eyes still locked on the creature. It was moving swiftly, its wings sending gusts of wind that whipped the room into chaos. The mercenaries were scattered, their weapons useless against the beast. Jard could hear them shouting, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of the creature and the sound of the crumbling walls. Lyra's calm demeanor was unsettling. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't running. Her eyes were narrowed in concentration, as if she were focused on something only she could see. "Lyra," Jard shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "What are you doing? We need to leave, now." But she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the creature. "It's too late to run," she said, her voice eerily calm. "The gateway is opening, there's nothing we can do to stop it now." Jard's heart skipped a beat. "The gateway? What do you mean?" Lyra's eyes finally shifted to him, her expression unreadable. "The artifact is not just a key, it's a portal," she said softly, as if the words were too heavy to speak out loud. "A portal to a place beyond this universe, and once it's open, there's no turning back." Jard felt a chill run down his spine. "A portal to where?" "To them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "To the beings who have been waiting for centuries, the ones who were locked away, hidden by my ancestors, and now, because of us, they're free." Before Jard could respond, the ground shook violently again, and the creature's massive form swiped at one of the mercenaries. He was thrown against the far wall with a sickening crack. The others were scrambling to get to their feet, but the creature was relentless. It was like nothing Jard had ever seen before, a creature of pure destruction. "We need to move," Jard shouted again, his grip tightening on Lyra's arm. "They're going to kill us all." But Lyra didn't move. Instead, she turned to face the creature once more. Her face was full of determination, and for a moment, Jard saw a side of her that he hadn't expected. Someone who had lived through unimaginable battles, someone who had faced things far worse than what they were dealing with now. "We can't stop it," she said, almost as if she were talking to herself. "The only way to stop it is to close the gateway, but we need to do it together. You and I," Jard frowned, confusion washing over him. "What are you talking about? What do we need to do?" "The artifact is a key, yes," she said. But it also has a second function. It connects to the bloodline. Your bloodline, Jard. Jard stepped back, his mind racing. What do you mean, my bloodline? Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jard saw a flicker of something almost like fear, in her eyes. You are the descendant of the human explorers who first discovered the artifact. Your ancestors were the ones who hid it, hoping to protect the galaxy from what it could unleash. But now, the portal is open, and we need your blood to close it. Jard felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. My blood? How is that even possible? The artifact chooses, Lyra said, her voice steady, though her hands were trembling slightly. It recognizes the blood of those who sealed it away. Your ancestors were part of a team of humans who locked this gateway, but now only the descendants of that bloodline can control it. Jard's mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. It was too much. He wasn't even sure what was happening anymore. But Lyra's urgency, the fear in her voice, and the sheer power of the creature that was now rampaging through the room left him with no choice. He had to trust her. He had to believe her, even if it sounded insane. How do I do it? Jard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra nodded toward the artifact. You need to touch it. Your blood will activate its power, but we must do it together. We need to combine our energy to close the gateway. Before Jard could ask any more questions, there was another loud crash. The creature, its wings still flapping furiously, lunged at one of the mercenaries, its claws tearing through the air. The last mercenary was already retreating, running toward the exit, but it was clear they were all outmatched. The creature was too powerful, too fast. Jard's eyes shifted back to Lyra, his hand reaching for the plasma gun at his side. But Lyra grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Leave it, she said firmly. It won't help. We need to close the portal or none of us are getting out of here. Jard hesitated for a moment, the weight of her words settling on him. This was it. There was no more time to think, no more time to question anything. If they didn't act, they would all die. He wasn't sure how much of this he believed, but he knew one thing for certain. The creature was real. The danger was real. And if he didn't help Lyra, they would all be trapped in whatever nightmare this was. He nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it. Together, they moved toward the pedestal. The artifact was still glowing, its light brighter than ever, but there was a strange pull to it, like it was calling to him. Lyra stepped beside him, her hand moving over the artifact's surface as she spoke softly in that strange language again. The symbols on the artifact began to shift, their glow intensifying. Jard took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out with his hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the artifact's surface. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. It was like the artifact was pulling him into another world. His vision blurred and his entire body seemed to tingle with raw power. Stay with me, Jard, Lyra's voice cut through the haze. Focus on the light, focus on closing the portal. Jard tried to concentrate, but the energy was overwhelming. He felt as though he were losing himself, slipping into the artifact's pull. The room around him seemed to stretch, the walls disappearing into a swirling void. He could feel the creature's presence behind him, its massive form looming like a shadow over them. It was still growling, still trying to reach them. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Jard felt it, the bond. A surge of connection between him and Lyra, something deep and ancient, something beyond bloodlines. He realized then that she wasn't just asking for his blood. She was asking for him to connect with her, to unlock the full power of the artifact. He reached out, finding her hand in the chaos, and together they focused on the artifact. The energy surged, and suddenly the room lit up with a blinding white light. And then, everything went silent. The blinding light surrounded them, filling every corner of the room and then extending beyond it. Jard's body felt as though it was being pulled apart, stretched thin across the universe. The energy from the artifact surged through him, overwhelming every sense. He could feel the connection between himself and Lyra, her hand gripping his tightly as they both focused on the artifact's power. It was like nothing he had ever experienced. The light wasn't just a physical force. It was alive, pulsing with energy, with memories. He saw images flash before his eyes, distant stars, forgotten worlds, ancient battles. His ancestors, those human explorers, standing before the artifact, sealing away the creatures that had once ruled the galaxy. The memories were not his, yet they felt as though they were his own. The weight of that history pressed down on him, and for a moment he could feel the immense responsibility of it all. Lyra's voice broke through the haze. "Focus, Jard. Focus on closing the portal." Her voice was the anchor he needed. He fought to keep his mind from slipping into the overwhelming tide of energy. He reached out to her, felt the connection between them like a rope pulling him back from the edge of a chasm. Together, they held the power of the artifact. Together, they could seal the gateway. The creature's growl echoed through the air, distant but still powerful. It was still out there, still struggling to reach them. Jard could feel the darkness it carried, the destruction it sought to unleash. He could feel the force of it pressing against the barrier that the artifact had created, a barrier that was weakening. "Now," Lyra urged, her voice trembling. "Close the gateway." Jard didn't hesitate. He focused on the image of the artifact's symbols, their light burning brightly in his mind. The memories of his ancestors guided him. He could hear their voices, urging him to finish what they had started, to keep the galaxy safe from the creatures that lay on the other side. With a deep breath, Jard reached for the artifact, letting its energy flow through him. The symbols on its surface flared bright, a brilliant burst of light, and then a powerful pulse shot out from the artifact, rippling through the room like a shockwave. The creature screamed, its roar filled with rage and frustration, but it was too late. The portal was closing. Jard's head spun as the light intensified. He could feel the fabric of space itself bending, the world around him warping, but they were winning. The connection between him and Lyra grew stronger, and he felt the power of the artifact receding into the stone, locking the portal once again. The ancient power that had been unleashed began to settle back into its resting place. The creature's presence, once so overpowering, began to fade, its power draining away as the portal collapsed. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light disappeared. Jard stumbled backward, his knees buckling beneath him. He could barely keep his balance, the strength drained from his body. His head was spinning and his vision blurred. He felt exhausted, as though he had been holding back an entire galaxy's worth of pressure. But there was no time to rest. He blinked, looking around. The room was no longer shaking. The walls, which had been crumbling before, were still intact. The artifact's glow had dimmed, returning to its dormant state. There was silence now, a deep, calm silence that felt as though the storm had finally passed. Jard looked over at Lyra. She was standing, though she looked just as exhausted as he felt. Her face was pale, but there was a look of relief in her eyes. She met his gaze, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's over," she whispered, her voice quiet but filled with the weight of everything they had just done. Jard nodded slowly, still catching his breath. "Is it really over? Can we be sure?" Lyra stepped toward him, her eyes scanning the room. "It is. The portal has been sealed, and the creatures who were waiting on the other side are locked away once again. It will take centuries, if not longer, for them to find another way out." "But the mercenaries, they're still," Jard started to ask, but his voice trailed off when he realized the mercenaries were gone. The room was empty. The few who had been left were nowhere to be seen. Had they fled in the chaos? Had they been caught in the closing of the portal? He wasn't sure. The only thing that mattered now was that the immediate threat was gone. "They didn't make it," Lyra said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "They were too close to the explosion when the portal closed. There was nothing we could do." Jard's gaze drifted to the wreckage of the room. It was hard to believe everything had happened so quickly. One moment, he was fighting to survive against a mercenary force. The next, he was closing a portal to another dimension, stopping a creature from destroying everything in its path. "You did well," Lyra said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We did well." Jard didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. He felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. He had saved the galaxy, or at least part of it, but it was hard to feel triumphant when everything around him was still so uncertain. "We're not done yet," Jard said after a moment, looking down at the artifact. "There's still so much we don't understand, and what if more of those creatures are still out there waiting?" Lyra turned to look at the artifact too. "There will always be threats, but for now the gateway is closed. The galaxy is safe for now. We've bought it time." "We've bought everyone time." Jard thought about her words for a long moment. It was true. They had done something that no one else could have done. Together they had sealed away a force that could have wiped out everything they knew. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't known what to do," Lyra's eyes softened. I didn't do this alone, Jard. It was you too. You're more connected to this than you realize. You were the key. He wasn't sure what to say to that. He didn't feel like a key. He just felt human. But something had changed. In that moment when they had worked together to close the gateway, Jard had felt more than human. He had felt connected to something ancient, something bigger than himself. I'm not sure what's next, Jard admitted, looking around the quiet room. But I guess we'll figure it out together. Lyra gave him a small, reassuring smile. We will, we always do, Jard nodded. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air, but there was also a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they had a future. The artifact, the creatures, the mercenaries, they were all behind them now. And though the galaxy would always be full of dangers, they had taken a step toward making it a safer place. As they stood in the quiet aftermath of the chaos, Jard couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. It wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning, and whatever came next, they would face it together.